Hello, it is Sarah Lane-Hawn, and
Danielle Urban.
we are here with more Lunchable go-to-market ops for you. I'm excited to do continual grab and go HubSpot strategies in 15 minutes or less each weekday. Today, we're continuing our conversation on attribution, and we wanted to get into the weeds a little bit on when it's appropriate to use influenced revenue versus actual revenue in your attribution modeling. I feel like it's important, Danielle, that we define these. Can you give us an understanding of what do we mean when we're talking influenced revenue? What do we mean when we're talking actual revenue?
Yeah, it's funny because that influence number can look really big. And some people are like, cool, big numbers. We love lots of dollar signs. And other people are like, that's so big, it's not real. So the influenced is usually in the context of talking about marketing or sales, or marketing versus sales, unfortunately, and looking at the influence that the activities of one team or the other have had over that revenue closing. And so all of the activities sort of work together to get a deal closed. You know, you have somebody download an asset, you see them at an event, you set up a meeting. At that meeting, it's a salesperson talking to them, then they have follow up. So then you've got all these different touch points that are influencing that revenue. And so that's how you would calculate that, is like, if any of these things happened, count it in this nice big number. When we talk about created attribution, what's the other word? I'm just totally
I mean,
blank.
I use actual, but I feel like that's
Actual
misleading. So, yeah,
generated.
creative makes a
Yeah.
lot
So
more
like
sense.
marketing generated, actual, created, whatever terminology you're using internally. This is another point where it really comes down to like, where did it start? And there can be some discrepancies we talked about earlier this week, and like, what is the initial touch point? And you sort of have to define internally what that kickoff point is. Is it the first time that they do something, that the contact does something to interact with your brand, and that sort of transaction of handing over information happens? Is it the first time they interact and you have like a digital stamp of that somewhere? Is it when the deal is created? So you have to sort of define what that point of creation is, and then define what activity you can attribute that creation to. So if it was like a marketing download, then we say it's marketing generated revenue, or it's, you know, that white paper that generated the revenue. And so you can kind of hang your hat on that one number. And that's always going to be lower because you have less activities feeding into it. There's only one data point versus many. And that's really the difference.
Yeah, and I think that's the point, right? Is like you understanding that if you're using influenced revenue, you're probably looking at it from a channel first
Yeah.
perspective. So you're saying, how much impact did my webinars have this year? Every single deal that you've had that was touched by a webinar along their buying cycle, we count all of it. So if 100% of your deals had a contact attend a webinar, you're getting 100% of
Yeah.
your revenue is falling into that webinar bucket. But then if you're also reporting on, say, your outbounding calls, and 100% of those were also impacted by outbounding, well, now both of those categories are showing all of that revenue. And that's okay when used appropriately, but it's just important to know that that's what it is. So what's the scenario that you would advise we use influenced revenue for? What's the benefit of looking at that number?
Um, it depends. It's our favorite answer for everything. Um, but I think when you have an organization, and hopefully everyone's working towards this, where sales and marketing are really aligned to that revenue number, and you don't have to sort of hash out who did what. I mean, it's always good to have that sort of background information, but when you are really talking about your strategy and your breakdown in budget, and how you're going to divide up resources for the next year, that influence number can really show you what matters. And my favorite case study of this, favorite slash the thing I hate most in the world, is when you have sort of a marketing enabled outreach effort. So if you have your SDRs sending out a link to an upcoming webinar, like, who gets that credit?
Right.
So that's where, you know, influence can really help. And if you have some bucketing within that influence, like, okay, well, this is, you know, downloadable gated assets, this is a website visit.
Yep.
That's where I've done some live streams and some webinars, podcasts, whatever you want to call this, on scoring to help sort of weight and understand that a little bit more clearly. And looking at that for like top of funnel pre opportunity and then post opportunity and like what happens after the opportunity is created. And so that influence number can really help you understand how much traction either team is getting. And we keep talking about marketing and sales, but this could even extend into like customer success and upsells. You know, if marketing is creating assets and content to help with that channel as well, you know, you really just need to understand where those touch points break down to. And you've got sort of different labels you can put on them to slice and dice that influenced revenue to give you some usable information to drive your strategy.
Yeah. And I also think influenced revenue is wonderful in that it's easier to get to. You can
Yeah.
calculate that so much more easily
Yes.
within HubSpot. And so for a day-to-day user, if you're a marketing user and you either own a specific channel or you're looking at a comparison between channels, I think it's really important to look at influenced revenue for the purpose of either budgeting, right? Of, to your point, what is making the most influence and kind of the most traction within what's turning into closed won deals. The other piece of it is within a single channel, being able to put side by side like the individual webinars and say, how much did this webinar influence?
Mm-hmm.
And if you put those side by side, you might be able to then do an analysis of whether it's time of day or speakers or your topics, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whatever you've been testing, you'll have a revenue number to actually assign to that.
Right.
And again, it's not super difficult to get to those numbers. And so I think for a day-to-day marketer, you probably live in influenced revenue when you're trying to do your own assessment. What's important to me is that when you report that number up, having to be very clear that you know that this is influenced revenue. You are not solely responsible for bringing in that dollar figure to the company. You know, it is one piece of a bigger picture, and you are using it just as a number to analyze how the comparison is. You are not using that as your associated value number for what you brought into the company. And as long as I think you know that and you can articulate that, then the number is useful. Where I see people fall is when somebody's putting pressure on like event marketing to say, hey, we need to know what your actual revenue influence was this year to justify your ROI.
Right.
And they go claim all of the influenced revenue as we did this.
Yep.
Well, now people are going to poke holes in it and say, no, you can't claim more than 100% of the revenue for the company, right?
Yeah.
Like there's a lot more that has to be unpacked there. So knowing its place in analysis of channel comparison or individual, you know, event comparison, those are the two purposes, and it's super valuable there.
Yeah, that's such a great call out. And I think to look at the flip side, you know, everybody wants to understand generated revenue or the breakdown of how revenue started and got created, because that is the easiest thing to build projections on. So it's like if we're looking at resourcing for the next year, then how do we, and setting our goals for the next year, how do we slice and dice the number that we got this year, apply our, you know, 20 or 100% increase or whatever we're aiming for the next year, and then break it out to set goals for each team and expectations for ROI on all this budget and headcount and all of these things. So everybody wants that number, but it's way harder to get to.
Way
And like,
harder to get to, unless you're doing what you were talking about and doing like single touch,
yeah,
you know, credit.
yeah,
And it's
last touch.
just
But
these
even
ones
that,
like came from a webinar, but like,
yeah.
you know, yeah,
But
anything
if it's
beyond.
your SDR that sent out the webinar, who did
Well, yeah,
it?
yeah. Then you get into the nitty gritty of the arguments. And man, we did at one company I worked for, we had a pseudo first touch, last touch like system, but then we
I'm
gave
intrigued.
credit for just one. Anyway, the level of criteria matching that we had to do in Salesforce for the if then logic to account for just all of the variables for that of like, well, if an SDR touched it, but nobody responded to the
Right.
SDR, then it was still marketing. But if the SDR had gotten responses within 30 days and then somebody came through a marketing engagement, really the SDR still gets credit for that. And what I found was the reasoning behind that of why we got there was because we were trying to do commission
Mm,
based attribution at the same time as doing our actual marketing and sales attribution for a channel basis. And so again, it came back to that what we talked about the other day, which
yeah.
is like you got to know the purpose of
Oh,
your
yes.
model and don't try to put more in one system
Yeah.
than you really need. Build two systems for that. Build a commission
Or three or
process,
four.
but yeah, build an attribution process.
Yeah.
Don't need to muddy the waters there.
Yeah.
Um, when we talk, true attribution generated, by a specific channel, that for me is really important when you're talking executive summary, board,
Yeah.
fundraising, things at that level, right?
Yeah.
Because you're actually comparing, you want real dollars
Yeah.
and you're looking at 100% of the revenue brought into the company and dividing it out. So there's no double counting.
Right.
You're making it very clear. And that I think is what a lot of people think of when they're asking for revenue attribution.
Yeah.
Um, where I've run into the struggles there, besides the just actually building something that works to capture that, right,
Hmm.
is the understanding of, you know, do we want to weight things? How do we
Yeah.
want, which channels do we want to include? Because we're not going to actually count every single activity ever. It's not going to
Right.
happen. So which ones are we choosing on purpose and which ones are we not? But the goal at the end of the day is 100% of your dollars broken out into channels,
Hmm.
so that you can actually say, here then using that number was the ROI of our webinars
Right.
versus using the influenced, revenue, which
Yeah.
is going to be double counting. It's going to be large. There's also a lot more filters and stuff that you need to do if you're trying to get it down to, you know, every dollar having a place
Yeah.
is very, very difficult there.
Well, and investing is such a good call out, or seeking investment, because I've sat in those meetings where you have to create the model. You build the model that shows $1 in equals $3 out, or whatever you need it to. And
Yep.
so everyone wants to simplify it to that, so that, the CEO can make decisions, so that the board can understand what's happening, so that they can sign off on budgets, so they can seek more investment. But you have to get it to the model.
Right.
And that's where it becomes so, so important, and everybody really stresses about it. But it's so hard to get to.
It is, and it's all theoretical at the end of the day, right?
Yeah.
But that's what brought me to creating like a model in HubSpot, was because I didn't think influence revenue was helpful to what
Yeah.
we were trying to accomplish from like establishing ROI. And then we needed multi-touch because it was a long buying cycle. And so it didn't make sense to do
Right.
first or last touch. Um, so, I mean, I think there's a great use case and need for it, but understanding that like most of my day-to-day marketers are never going to touch that true revenue
Yeah.
attribution report to make any decisions. Like
Yeah.
they're not going to. The head of marketing is going to look at it because they're going to want to be able to tie it to their narrative of what they've experienced and what they're planning.
Yep.
That's kind of it. And then, and then it's going to get shown to the executive team and the board on a quarterly basis. So I think, at least in my experience, that's the use for it, in which case it does start to beg the question, like, how much effort, how much should we actually put into building something that
Hmm.
is accurate, that is trustworthy, but that is only used by a few people a few times a year.
Right.
So, any last thoughts before we sign off for today, and we will continue our attribution conversation tomorrow?
Yeah. I think, don't underestimate how hard this is. Resource this effort appropriately, so that you can get the answers you want and keep your scope really tight on what you're trying to accomplish. It all comes back to what questions you're trying to answer, and then building to that question and nothing else.
Awesome. We'll see you tomorrow on Lunchable Go to Market Ops.
Bye.
Bye.